Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here today. We're going to wait just a couple seconds as we admit final folks into the room, and then we'll get started.
Scared me. That's good, Gabe.
All right, we'll go ahead and start. Welcome, everyone. My name's Andrea Kraus. I'm the Community Development Manager at the Zeitgeist Center for the Arts and Community. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation about transportation with the mayors of Duluth and Superior. This is part of Zeitgeist's annual Bus Bike Walk Month. We start our events with the acknowledgement that Zeitgeist and the Twin Ports are built on land that was originally Anishinaabe-a-King and home to the Anishinaabe and Dakota people, the original stewards of this territory. This land was ceded by the Anishinaabe in the 1842 and 1854 treaties, and historically and today, it holds great significance for Indigenous people. We're committed to uplifting the name of these lands and the community members from these nations who reside alongside us. So this acknowledgement sets us up for today's discussion about the land we share, how we create communities that are welcoming, safe, and accessible for all, which is at the core of Bus Bike Walk Month events. So I'd encourage you to check out the full list of upcoming activities on our webpage. We'll put the link in the chat. And a big thank you to the event sponsors shown on the screen: CF Designs, EHR Go, MPECU, Maurice's, United Healthcare, St. Luke's, and Essentia, who along with a team of volunteers and committee members make these events possible. I'd also like to note the outstanding work of Stevie Twining, who's handling the tech for this event and almost every other event that's happened online this year with the pandemic, and some of our in-person events like the pop-up bike clinic that's happening tomorrow afternoon. So historically, we'd be hosting the Mayor's Bike Ride and speaking events in each city today. And we look forward to returning to that after the pandemic. But in lieu of the bike ride, we're here today for a virtual forum with Mayor Larson, Mayor Paine, and our moderator, Drew Digby. Drew has been involved in the work to improve the transportation system in Duluth for many years. He was part of the Knight Creative Community Institute Community Catalyst, serving as a change agent. In that role, he made commitment to educate, engage, and enable fellow citizens to build a more authentic, sustainable, and prosperous community. He was chair of the Active Living Community for Fit City Duluth, which eventually transitioned into the Healthy Duluth Area Coalition and the creation of an active transportation position with the YMCA and now Zeitgeist. He served on the Duluth Planning Commission and continues his dedication to our region as the executive director of the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council. We're grateful for your presence in this corner of the world, Drew, and for your moderation of today's conversations. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here. My job as moderator is hopefully to not say much and let Jim and Emily talk amongst themselves and cut in to keep things on track. I'm going to first introduce the mayors and then sort of lay out a big question to start with, but we'll move into some speed questions after that. So first I'll introduce Jim Paine. He's been mayor of Superior since 2017. Prior to serving as mayor, Paine served as the vice chair of the Douglas County Board of Supervisors. Some of his key transportation accomplishments include the adoption of the Active Transportation Plan, hiring the nation's leading people and firms, the gold standard in their respective fields, to work plan on Superior projects, and he had been known for rethinking the streets, challenging the status quo, trying new things, bike share, painted crosswalks, street reconfigurations, doubling funding for sidewalk construction, and purchasing new equipment. His undergraduate degree from the University of Wisconsin Superior and a master's degree from UMD. Emily Larson has been mayor of Duluth since 2016. Prior to becoming mayor, Emily was president of the Duluth City Council, served as a commissioner on the Duluth Economic Development Authority, and was the council conduit to parks and libraries. Some of her major transportation accomplishments include the adoption of the transportation sales tax, a dedicated funding source for fixing streets, and creating 2 new City of Duluth positions, a transportation planner and a sustainability officer. And I will say that the transportation planner is something long dreamed about by advocates for biking. If I can't say biking, walking, and transit day, I'll be in trouble. She has an undergraduate degree from the College of St. Scholastica, a master's from the University of Minnesota Duluth, and is a graduate of the Intermediate Arts Creative Community Leadership Institute. Very quickly, some definitions. Active transportation, modes of biking, walking, and public transportation. The term walking is inclusive and means anyone moving by their own means or without assistive devices, such as wheelchairs, walkers, strollers, and those with hearing or sight impairments, or any other person with limited mobility. So we mean everything. And also on everyone and all means everyone, people who walk, bike, bus, drive a car, take a taxi, Uber drivers, skateboarders, children, senior citizens, military veterans, people with limited mobilities, locals, tourists, motorcyclists, people homeless, everyone. So the first question is a big one. It's a vision question. The design of our city's transportation system is not inevitable. Each city decides what transportation system it wants. If you focus on making it car-centric, the streets will be filled with cars. If you make walking, cycling, and transit a priority, people will utilize those modes. It all depends on what kind of city we want. Every year in our region, transportation, and roads specifically, is a $50 million opportunity to build our community better and more equitably. Over the course of the next 20 years, $1 billion will be spent on transportation. While it takes time and money to bring visions to fruition, it is possible that as streets have to be restriped nearly every year, roadway work takes place each year, and over a 20-year time period, every major road in the region will have some level of work. So just describe your vision and how do we as a community bring this vision to fruition? I did the introduction starting with Mayor Paine, so I'll ask that first question to Mayor Larson.
Great. Thank you, Drew. And thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the work you do. Thanks for challenging us to be bigger and better and bolder, and reminding us that communities are built for their chosen built environments, which is, I think, a great way of how you position that, Drew. And then and that we get to choose. We get to, exert our force where we can, when we can, how we can, to make things better. I did have just one follow-up question to this question when I read it, Drew, and it's okay if you don't have the answer to it, but the $50 million a year, that must be looking at state, federal, and local. Everything. Okay.
Everything.
Got it.
Yeah. We got it from the folks at the MIC. So.
Yeah. Got it. That's kind of what I was assuming. So my biggest dream, my biggest vision is to have a city where people who have the choice of mobility, have the supported choices to be able to move around as best suits them, and that people who are walking feel safe walking, people who are biking feel safe biking. I know for many of you, that's not your experience now. I know that's not my experience now in this community and in this city. I have worked in different ways to try to advance active transportation, and it is so important to have you, all of you on this call, working, pushing, coming up with examples, because it is a highly political process. It doesn't, in my mind, have to be that way, but we need the grassroots groundswell that people who choose to, choose their mobility through means other than driving and parking their car are equally valued members of our community, along with people who choose to drive and park the car in a parking ramp. So my biggest dream is partly the road that we're on, which is that we have a transportation planner. When I came into office, and I don't want this to become like a campaign speech, so I'll try to dial down some of that tone of it, but there was no plan. We would go year by year, fixing streets, maybe fixing sidewalks. There was no cohesive plan around, okay, well, when does that utility need to be fixed on this street? How are we going to do that? What about the sidewalks? What about safe routes to school? So we're getting there. This transportation position planner that we have is one example of how we do this. what that person's job is to go out into the community. That's easier to do when it's not a pandemic, but to take in input, to put all of that together, to work with our Commission on Disabilities, to actually work with our Commission on Human Rights. We are looking at transportation as a human rights issue too. So, my biggest dream is that transportation is taken out of the kind of nerdy, wonky, doesn't matter kind of feeling that a lot of people have. And it's actually lifted up as an example of that intersection of equity and access and safety, and a sense of belonging, because we all know that when you feel like you can get around in your neighborhood, you're going to be more apt to do that. You're going to be a better neighbor. You're going to have a sense of what's happening. You're no longer just passing through a community, a neighborhood. You're actually spending time there. So my biggest vision, my best hope, and I think I'll just wrap it up here, Drew. I can go on, and you'll give us plenty of time to do that. But would actually be that transportation, the big bucket that you talked about, is seen and valued at that important intersection of human rights, equity, and economic opportunity, of all the things that we're no longer siloed thinking about it as just the means to get to the business, the means to get out of town. We're actually seeing it as like a human infrastructure issue. And I do feel like we're getting closer to that, but it's slow. Those are my initial thoughts anyway.
Thanks. Mayor Paine?
Echo a lot of what Mayor Larson said. She said it very, don't know that I can add too much to it. Maybe I sound nice, but there's something about your question that kind of intrigued me. You asked about our vision, and some of the political challenges of transportation is, I am very personally, I did campaign on that pretty unapologetic, concerned about the dangers, both mental harm of fossil. I personally walk to work every day. Life. So my vision, the Jim Paine vision, is focused primarily on the slowest and safest and most efficient pedestrians over bikes. I emphasize bikes over cars, and that's just my beliefs. And one of the things we run into, there are a lot of conflicting opinions, and you run into other interests really quickly. One of the things that we have to acknowledge, even if we for active transportation, is the use automobiles as the. So my big dreams of a primarily pedestrian, that's not politically realistic. In fact, you can move too quickly. I don't usually talk like that. That transportation politics is tough. Very important to have a clear vision. And so what I really had prepared to say, though, is a lot of what the mayor also just said of everybody, that like anything else we do in economic development, and we have to focus on out of our current systems, and again, hard to do politically. So I think the broad vision should be a human-centered approach or planning and implementation. People, even if they have a very close relationship to people's people. Traffic is cars, freight is of goods. And when we lump those into pure transport, it risks leaving people out, or it will always leave people out. And when you're not focused on people, are almost always the most marginalized and vulnerable. And so of how we should envision transportation, start small, and with by the chat section when it pops up. That's why we should start And when you look at the person, you can then of your planning, even when it goes beyond transportation. An opportunity to talk about how focusing on bikes and transit actually has pretty significant for businesses and for even relevant communities. So that's the big vision. Human-centered, what they're driving, not the product, and where they need to go.
Thank you. Actually, that kind of leads me right into my follow-up, and maybe Emily, you could tackle this one. I know from working on some of these decisions that there's a lot of people whispering in your ear, you know, whether it's a new sidewalk or a, you know, a big project that certain leaders have, you know, a voice in your ear. What is the best thing that walking and transit and bike advocates can do to kind of counter those whispers in the political ear so that, you know, we have a better chance of getting these things through without all of a sudden, it seems that sometimes there's a change is scary to people. And, you know, what are more things that we can do as advocates so that the voices whispering in your ear err on the side that we want them to side on?
Yeah, you know, it's funny how it's a great way to ask that question, actually, and it's really direct, which I really like about it. Land use issues are always really hard. They just are. You will always pit neighbor against neighbor. Doesn't matter if it's hey, can I put a garage or an accessory dwelling unit on my house? Or, you know, are we going to make this a two-way or a one-way street? It is just the nature of land use issues. And then the history of land, you know, as Andrea started us out with a land acknowledgement, you know, the story and history of land is also always there. And so I think what advocates can do is recognize that intersection is laden with those things too. And that a purist approach is difficult to navigate. I can be very strident, actually. And what's fun is now that I'm in my 6th year of this job, there are always people whispering in your ear. That's fine. That's part of it. One of the things I've worked super hard is you don't just get to call up the mayor and use your mayor card to get what you want. That was surprisingly hard to undo. And that's not a name calling on anyone who came before me. It is how people want to access you. And it's partly gender-based politics of how people feel they can access a woman leader and kind of demand attention. And that was actually part of the reason why we put in a process and actually tried to tried to make more formal the process of how we make decisions around transportation planning. I don't want to be willy-nilly about it. I don't want to just cater to a certain group. I am so used to pissing people off. I do it all day long, and it's not just to my kids, right? And that's just the nature of the job. So you get comfortable as a decision maker in listening and weeding those things out and coming to the true essence of what this is. So I have gotten better about saying, okay, well, this, you know, yep, there's politics, there's going to be noise. That's just the nature of land use. That's the nature of people picking one side over the other. My job is to make note of the noise, to hear it in the background, but to go back to the inner voice of what the vision is of this community, of this project, of accessibility. And so what's helpful, you know, I have found, just to be, you know, I'm a solid lefty in terms of politics. There's no surprise there. I'm not revealing anything big. Lefties can be very condescending sometimes in how we deliver our message. Doesn't matter what it is. That's no slam against active transportation. It's on anything. It's on all our things. And I think sometimes we need to be strategic about who's our messenger going to be, what's the overall message going to be, where do we want to strategically say we're going to get a win by doing this, where do we strategically want to say, okay, that political path isn't there, if we think about Superior Street as a good example of the bike path, which was several years ago, started before I was mayor, I think mostly ended before I was mayor too. as one of only 2 counselors who wanted to put a bike path on Superior Street. Maybe that wasn't the best place to put it, but to actually stand in a space of values of, I will stand in this idea that active transportation needs to be on our main corridor, needs to be protected, needs to be safe. What is the secondary win going to be for us if we don't have the votes to get there? And sometimes I think we collectively miss the chance to be strategic about what's plan A, plan B, plan C. We always have a best hope. And when I meet with people, I will always say, tell me what your best hope is. I want to know what your ideal would be. I don't know if I can get there. I don't know if that's possible, but if I know what it is, I can think through a little bit more, what is getting us close to that look like, or what are the resistance points going to be? And so sometimes I think it's just being more strategic collectively, being cognizant that there are a lot of active dynamics that I can't control, that you can't control, that Jim can't control. They're just inherent to land use issues. And I think to understand that movement is happening. Movements do take time. When I think a lot about the last, like in the 6 years that I've had this job, the movement we've seen on a couple of issues, Black Lives Matter is one of them, police reform is another one. I don't want to compare what's more valuable, what's happening, but just very big issues. The public resistance to some of those 6 years ago versus where the public is now, vastly different, because the strategy and organizing was there to, provide a cohesive message. And we've seen just considerable events happen and people saying, well, that's enough. What we don't want to have happen is communities start getting serious about active transportation because there's been a big accident, or, we want to avoid the trauma that can come with that. But, that's some of my thought. I think we have missed the opportunity to be strategic. I think we go project by project sometimes, like, let's get the bike lane here, or let's look at removing parking here. That makes it a very specific neighbor versus neighbor fight, which is very different than this kind of overall strategy and a vision. And so I'd be really interested to hear what this group and others who maybe aren't able to be here today would say about where are those strategy points, where are those vision points that we can start getting buy-in on that allows us to remove it from project by project, intersection by intersection. And just to reframe it a little bit. I hope that's, I hope that's helpful.
Good. Mayor Paine, you started a little bit on the politics of this, but do you have specific advice for the advocates about how to better make their case, or how is it, you're trying to do this work? What kind of advocacy help do you need from people who want to see more walking, biking, and good transit?
Yeah, well, my first piece of advice is listen to Emily Larson. I could listen to that all day long. That was just incredible. Especially, I had never considered, having alternatives to good plans. I know it sounds so, I'm in year 4 here and it seems so basic, but for me, plan A is get what I want and plan B is freak out. And so it's, I don't have a lot to add to that, because she described very well the very complex politics that we face. And I think she did offer some really good suggestions. The only one that I might add is let's look at how comprehensive every individual project can be, or what else it can add beyond just transportation benefits. One of the things I learned early on about transportation planning, for a little more history, I served on the MIC for several years before I was the mayor, and I'm consistently shocked at how awful the conversation can be around changes in any kind of transportation. If you change the way people move, in especially their day-to-day commute, they absolutely lose their minds, even when all of the data, all common sense can show that this is an actual improvement for them, that it will make their lives safer and more efficient, and probably improve our community in other ways. They don't want to hear it. Change is bad, always, when it comes to transportation. So some of the things I've seen work before, I don't want to take any credit, but when when you're doing more to the surrounding land use, when you look at a space rather than just a transportation corridor or section, or even down to an intersection, look at how you're improving the overall experience around it. So, I mean, we do sidewalk work. You mentioned that in my intro. That actually became a problem. That was the first time we ever invested local money in sidewalks in decades. We were just getting the federal grant money. And so that meant we were putting sidewalks into new neighborhoods, but that's all we did in the project. And I got more complaints than compliments. I mean, people who had terrible sidewalks got brand new infrastructure here and they didn't like it. You know, we tore up a part of their lawn, it didn't get seeded right. They didn't like the interruption, and did we really even need it? And they didn't do it right. And most of that was just really small stuff. We made a real improvement in their neighborhoods, but now, if you tear up the sidewalk and plant trees all along their boulevard, or, and that's just a small example, a better one, if you're working on a street project and there are aesthetic improvements around it, even relatively small stuff, improve the lighting, improve the green infrastructure around it, make the space just better, just make it nicer, then the transportation stuff starts taking a back seat a little bit. And the more improvement you do to the overall area, the better it just, the better the public seems to just receive it. So I think it's not going to work in every case. I think to some extent, the conversations around transportation are always going to be tough. And I'm glad you called it out. It's going to be tougher for certain leaders than others. Generally underrepresented people, women, people of color are going to take more grief. It's crazy that happens in transportation. I don't know what's gendered about transportation, but women leaders are going to have a harder time of it. So they do need more support. But one of the ways we get that stuff done, again, is help more people than just the folks using the transportation corridor. Make it just a better place, offer more things to more people. Then you're bringing in more allies. You're bringing in the business community. You're bringing in the surrounding residents that can cheer for something. And that helps drown out the people that are just criticizing because they don't like change.
So Mayor Larson, that means you'd support turning instead of the big can of worms project to just turn it into an 8-lane traffic circle. No.
Hey, I like the roundabouts. I like roundabouts.
Actually, Mayor Larson, so you recently talked about wanting Duluth to be the greenest city in the country.
Yeah.
What does that mean in terms of transportation infrastructure?
Well, it's interesting. I think you can't talk about being green without talking about transportation infrastructure, right? So it's how we build it, it's the materials we build, it's, you know, whose neighborhood are we going through? I mean, there again, if you're thinking about, you know, interstate, you know, here we have redlining, here we have separation of communities, here we have like the can of worms is actually a great example, Drew. It's, I mean, as you know, a project that's been in the works for probably 10 years. And so, you know, we have, imagine how much change has happened in the last decade of how we see ourselves, what we're being truthful and honest about, and the plans that, you know, have evolved a bit along the way, but a lot of it is still that kind of technology and thinking. So to me, it's, you know, how we build intersections, it's bioswales at intersections, it's the paving materials that we use that identify, you know, mobility and sight lines for people who need some of that. It's how we're, you know, for us in this area, weather is an issue, right? Water is horrible for streets. It's terrible for streets. It's terrible for sidewalks. We have a lot of water issues here. So, you know, and water and transportation go hand in hand. Every time we're tearing up a street, we're trying to now touch the infrastructure underneath it to make sure that at least we don't have to go back in 2 years or 3 months or next week to fix something underneath it. So how we're thinking about the street as a total, you know, how we're thinking about construction as a total package there is something really important too. So, and then, you know, for me, sustainability is also about, well, how does it, you know, and Jim touched on some of this, and I thought you did it in an awesome way, Jim, which is like, well, how do you experience it? How does it feel? You know, it feels great to walk down a street that has some shade, where the sidewalk is not like 6th Avenue East, where it's bumped right up against the street. There's no shade, there's no slowing of traffic, there's no traffic diet. how are we using our built environment as a way to encourage connection and encourage, sustainable humanity? So, I mean, that's some of it for me. I don't know if you want me to go on a little bit more there, Drew, but.
No, that's great. We've only, I know all of you
Yeah.
could talk for 6 hours on this, so I'm really excited to talk. Mayor Paine, you refer to the city of Superior as a water city because of Lake Superior, the streams, the St. Louis River. How does that impact your vision for transportation?
Well, I'd love to say we're going to have water-based transportation more. We actually have 3 navigable rivers within the city of Superior. And Superior is, I think we have a different relationship with water than the city of Duluth. I mean, the challenges of being on a hill are very different than the challenges of being in a swamp, which almost all of Superior is wetland. Please, I promise I say swamp very affectionately. I've lived here my whole life, and I've come to actually enjoy the mosquitoes. But so in terms of how it affects transportation, it's really about resiliency. And I'm glad to see that term start to get quite a bit more traction at the state and federal levels, including when you see state and federal grant funding, because that has not been how transportation planning and construction has happened, especially when it comes to the federal level. So both cities have experienced catastrophic flooding, significant infrastructure damage, but for a long time, really now still, when you apply for FEMA funds, you have to rebuild the way it was built originally, in other words, vulnerable to flooding. And so as flooding becomes worse in the climate crisis, we're building and rebuilding streets that can't, and all infrastructure that can't handle it. That's the opposite of resilience. So at least in our planning locally, and now we're seeing it at the state level, and I think we're about to really see it at the federal level too. We're looking at every single project, not just building it the way it was built before, but thinking about how can these projects first handle water damage from catastrophes, but how can they just handle water better in general? Every rain event is potentially harmful to the streams and creeks in the Lake Superior watershed, just from gray infrastructure. Anytime water moves over it, it's potentially or actually polluting our surrounding waterways. And so I think every transportation project needs to take that into account. What is the relationship between built infrastructure and the surrounding water? And the solution is almost always just add more green. And there's almost always great opportunities for that. But like what I was talking about before, don't just add green infrastructure for green infrastructure's sake. It shouldn't just be about flooding mitigation. That's important. But when you're building it, it's probably not flooding right now, today. And so people aren't worried about the flood. They're worried about the flood when it's happening. That's our job to worry about it. But what they really get excited about is a street that's beautiful, a neighborhood that's beautiful. And I appreciated what Emily said about the difference between a street that has trees and doesn't. That's true all 4 seasons. You ever see a tree-lined street in the winter when you just had a wet snow? It's absolutely magical, and we're one of the only places that that has that. And so you end up getting these benefits that extend far beyond transportation or resiliency or environmental protection. It's really just making a better place to live. And there's benefits that people won't even personally experience on a day-to-day basis.
I want to talk a minute about equity. And if you look at the data, it's really clear that low income and people of color are disproportionately killed and injured as pedestrians and bicycles at road crossings due to unsafe road infrastructure. In Duluth Hillside, a third of the residents don't have a personal vehicle. There's a lot of places that clearly roads were built for people to get through them with very little regard for people who live in those neighborhoods. And Emily, you mentioned 6th Avenue East. That's always been my bugaboo. Are there a handful of projects you can talk about that really are on the books that will deal with some of these equity issues? 6th Avenue East is both an environmental nightmare as well as a residential nightmare. Or what projects will you put at the top of your equity list that need to get done in your community? I'll let you, Emily, first.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I'll just tell two quick little things. I was actually at, my youngest kid is graduating from high school this year. And so I was just at Myers Wilkins. So they do this thing where seniors put their gowns on and they go back to their elementary schools and, just show kids, this is what it looks like to graduate. It's really sweet. Anyway, what I was struck by is how many kids were not there, right? How many kids are probably not graduating this year. And, Drew, you and I have raised a kid together. We know, from Nettleton and Myers Wilkins, how important communities are, walkability, getting people access, removing any barriers so that people feel like I can go into that building. I can physically see my path, a safe path into that space. And that draws me into greater emotional connection, into feeling like that space can be mine. And so it's really interesting, some of what I've seen and what I saw happen there in terms of some of the street projects. They created a turnaround, a roundabout, and a kind of a dead end space in the middle of a neighborhood. That's really helped there a lot. I just don't have my street list in front of me, and I should have been prepared for that part of this question, Drew. But I think a lot about like the Can of Worms project. We got a ton of push. So that's a MnDOT project primarily. And there is a role for the city in that. I don't ever want to be a leader that's like, yeah, you should go talk to MnDOT about that, or that's a federal project. That is the space we get to that is our sandbox, right? It's in our city, it's in our neighborhood. Yes, there are dynamics and factors beyond the city that need to be, considered or controlled for, and those aren't ours to do. Our job is to say, understood we need to do this, understood that, this is an important connector and corridor, and we want to see benefit for the community in that. And for us, that is about connectivity, equity. And so what I'm seeing there, some of the growth and some of the change in terms of a protected bike lane, if you go through there now, it is a mess if you are a pedestrian to get through Lincoln Park. So, there's kind of some incremental change like that. There is the idea that Jordan has been floating, which is a really big idea. And I freaking love this vision, which is to do some highway removal, primarily targeting, or I suppose capping, but primarily targeting neighborhoods that have correlationary zip codes for disparity and equity issues. We're seeing a project in St. Paul in the Rondo neighborhood gain a lot of traction around that. And again, that's old news that continues to ripple very viscerally today, that redlining and that highway plow through of low income and marginalized neighborhoods that are primarily BIPOC. So, I have a lot of hopes for some of those projects, Drew, and I should have been up to speed and ready to talk about some specific ones, but I'm not, to be honest. Sorry.
Mayor Paine, that's fine. I understand. I just wanted to put a pitch in about 6th Avenue East being, please.
Yes.
Mayor Paine, do you have a sort of a project you think will work on some of these equity issues that is at the top of your list?
Yeah, and thankfully, because Emily went first, I had a few minutes to prepare and get ready.
You're welcome.
So I've got 3. One project that is underway right now, one that I'm going to announce right now, and another that's kind of a pipe dream. So the one underway, so everybody knows here what safe routes to school are, I think. And I think as a community, we do a good job of identifying what the routes are, but we could do a better job of making them safe, particularly in the winter. And so we looked to history to try and find a better way to do it, and found the city used to actually clear sidewalks, every single one. We prioritized sidewalks as highly as we did streets, and cleared them in roughly the same amount of time. We have these cool little trucks that fit on sidewalks called bombardiers. And so a couple of brave city councilors shouted the word bombardiers loudly and often enough that we bought one. They're not called bombardiers anymore, but we bought the first one and hired staff to start driving it. So this winter, we're going to start clearing paths to school to make sure children can safely and effectively walk to school in dedicated spaces. Then we're going to expand that program, hopefully buy more equipment and bring it to help other marginalized people, not just children, but everybody access the most common spaces in the community, like our downtown spaces. And I don't know that I'll ever be around long enough to see the whole city get cleared again, but we'll keep trying. Okay, so the announcement, I would very much like to and intend to expand DTA services in Superior to allow students in the school district to ride for free on the way to school and to and from school. Still working on the boundaries of that program exactly in both time and space. But the fact is, if you live less than 2 miles away from your school, at least the high school anyway, you don't qualify for busing. And that leaves a lot of people out, especially in tough situations. Try walking 1.5 miles in Twin Ports winter. It's rough. Or the way I grew up, living exactly 2 miles away, but the last person on the bus stop can barely fit on the bus. We know a lot of students experience bullying on the bus. The bus doesn't always fit their schedules or their lives. And so there's a lot of disenfranchisement in transportation for kids going to school. Even the fact when you're trying to participate in extracurricular activities, kids that rely on the bus may not necessarily be able to access the same things that kids living in more privilege are able to access. And that's just not fair. And so we're going to try and pick up the tab for them. The pipe dream is the way the Blotnick Bridge lands. One of the most economically disenfranchised areas in the city of Superior is our far north end. These are people that are, it is the highest population of primarily pedestrians where people don't have access to a car. We have a lot of subsidized housing in that area. A lot of low income families live in that area. And we have an effective highway on a city street. I mean, it comes down at a very steep grade. Traffic is moving very quickly and it plunges right into a neighborhood. And if you're familiar with how that worked, even how that street works, even a couple of years ago, we had a gas station, a spur right at the foot of the bridge, whose primary purpose was to sell food to the neighborhood. Well, Quick Trip does that just as effectively, but on the other side of the street, forcing people, a lot of them senior citizens, people living with disabilities, to cross an incredibly busy street. So my pipe dream would be to have that bridge land differently, or to somehow control the speed of traffic. I don't have a problem with how much traffic there is, just how fast it's going, and the fact that it doesn't stop for pedestrians. I think we can manage that better. And so I'd like to see highway traffic stay on the highway. Let's turn local traffic into purely local traffic at local traffic speeds and make it a neighborhood again, because that's what neighborhoods should be. City streets should be in neighborhoods. City streets should not be highways. That's a pipe dream. I don't know if I get to win that one, but we'll at least keep fighting it.
Great. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I'd like a quick response to, like 30 seconds. From an active transportation perspective, what is the one thing that you want to do that no other leader would necessarily do? Is there something that could be just sort of your own dream that you don't think it would be good, but is sort of your dream and not sort of everyone else's dream? Anyone want to take that one first?
Off the top of my head, free bikes. Bikes here, but for total 100% free. Anybody can use it anytime they want.
I would actually love to build our trail system as a transportation system and actually identify ways that you can get, I mean, we all know some hidden ways you can get on the trails, but, you know, get people out and actually in the woods a little bit more and to actually use that as ways to get to and from work. Whether it's going through these, you know, we've got 42 creeks that go up and down the hill that will never be developed. And how do we use those, not just as scenic, important public park assets, but also transportation corridors?
That was a cool answer.
Is there a tiny project that is good for active transportation you're working on right now that you want us to know about? Yes, not one of those big dreams. Is there a little dream that you know is happening in your city that is really cool right now? Do you guys have any of those coming up? Just a little improvement that you like, oh, this works, this works.
Yeah, it's not sexy, but I actually really, really like when we have those blinking lights at school intersections. You know, it's small, but really, really, really big. It's not, you know, all that fun. It's not all that creative, but it does a huge amount to keep kids safe as they're finishing that last, you know, 100 feet in the safe routes to school. And they're not that expensive.
Paint and crosswalks. I just love painting crosswalks. Filling them. We tried a couple years ago, tried a few different colors. We're going to keep doing it. I want to get super creative. I got to fight with the streets department about it, but I'd love to do it for pride. Make a rainbow right through the crosswalk. Yeah. It's just fun. It's cheap. And I think it does improve safety.
Yeah. So I want to make a pitch for that Highway 61, revisited project. What are things that we can be doing to make that a reality? Like, is there something you love most about it that we should all be screaming from the rooftops, let's make this happen? And what can Superior be doing to support that project too?
Jim,
what are the things that we should?
Jim, do you know the
Do you know this
project?
stuff?
I don't.
We'll have
I
to
know
make
the album.
You will love it. We'll have to make sure you get informed of it. I think you will really love it. It's primarily a money issue, to tell you the truth, Drew. So I think what the group is doing is amazing right now, which is just continuing to talk about it. We're going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep going into spaces and talking about it. The coalition of people who know about it, who like it, who are like, is growing. Everyone sees that part of the problem is a disconnect between downtown and Canal Park. Everybody sees that part of the opportunity is revitalization, reconnection, and just a greater ease of movement between. So part of what I think people should know that I'm doing, or that we're doing at the city, we're talking to MnDOT, we're talking to Senator Klobuchar, we're talking to the federal government, we're talking to transportation people to see what we can get for a planning grant that would potentially get us in motion for some other kinds of funding. There's no surprise there. I mean, Jordan and the group kind of know that. But I think just keep at it. Keep talking about it. This is how awesome big things happen, is people just, that base expands, and it's not just this one small group. It's like all of a sudden the Canal Park Business Group, the Chamber of Commerce, the MIC, it's growing and growing, and it's so exciting.
That gets into sort of the whole planning process for transportation. And, to me, when you look at that project, which would actually, in the long run, reduce the amount of road that would have to be maintained, cut money, be better for the environment, create more land that could be developed, more parkland. It's a win-win all around, but there's no money to make that transition. And it doesn't really work in the way that roads are planned, transportation is planned. Superior has its own Public Works Committee to sort of talk through those issues. Duluth doesn't have like a transportation commission. What's working on transportation planning in Superior, Mayor Paine, and what are things that need to happen? And then Emily, I'll ask you the same question of sort of what's happening and what could be happening to make that kind of planning for a better future more accessible.
Well, yes, we have a Public Works Committee, and Public Works is much more than just transportation. I think the counselors on it, especially recently, have pushed the conversation towards transportation. That's what's working. So it's just as easy to talk about infrastructure, which isn't necessarily the same as transportation. And so I think it's just, there's also something of a marriage between the Public Works Committee. Jenny Van Sickle, who chairs that committee, is also on the MIC and is bringing those two conversations together. There's a good relationship, I think, between the staff and the council, and I think a very strong willingness of the staff to reach out beyond their own comfort levels and to get used to new ideas, new concepts. I've been very impressed seeing a lot of them attend a lot of events, including things like this, to get new ideas and to try and implement them, the kind of stuff that they might not have been comfortable with even several years ago. So it really is the little collaboration stuff that feels like is working. I don't know that there's a big overarching thing. I mean, except that we have taken on some really big comprehensive planning efforts like the active transportation plan. And now we're incorporating large transportation conversations in the comprehensive plan. So that stuff's good, but plans don't do anything if people don't implement them. And so it's I think the relationships and the conversations that are making that work.
Now, Larson?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think the one strategy that's really effective is when Jim and I, or Jim or I, on anything, exert the influence that we have on a project, it can work. It's really powerful. That's just the nature of how power dynamics, leadership, and titles work. It matters if I'm going to call MnDOT or Senator Klobuchar and say, I really want you to look at this project. Now, what matters more is that when I finish that conversation, there's a groundswell of people who are there already, right? So I don't want to dismiss what happens in that pre. So I think it's important to remember that, decisions get made at lots of different levels, but to encourage people to continue to be kind of big and bold in what they do. We don't have a transportation committee, and here's where we're a little bit stuck on it. We do have a public utilities commission. We have about 30 different commissions, including human rights, Indigenous commission, African Heritage Commission. So looking at equity and humanity through a broader lens, and we do work with those commissions as we do our transportation planning. So we're doing it a little bit a different way. So our transportation planner works with these commissions, presents ideas, works with the Human Rights Commission, and the Disabilities Commission. So we just have a slightly different way of doing it. Where we get stuck, and part of it, I think, is just my bias for people to want to see transportation as a system, to get out of, okay, well, I'm on East 11th Street, and what's the project timeline for East 11th Street and the Hillside neighborhood and this 2-block stretch, and to be actually thinking broader and more holistically about it. And so that's where we've been a little bit stuck in terms of how do we want to have that be a transportation specific commission, along with, the participation we have in the MIC and the public process and the public engagements we do with City Hall and the city events around our transportation planning. So I think we're picking a different way of doing it that doesn't fit within a transportation committee model at this time. Doesn't mean it won't in the future. Doesn't mean that's not where we should or want to go. Just that we're choosing to do it in a way that my best hope is that people, again, are seeing that transportation is an issue of planning. It is a community development issue. It is a African Heritage Commission issue. We all get a piece of that in the same way that we do with some other issues. So,
and we had a question in the chat about someone relatively new to Duluth and saying, oh my God, you have so many parking lots. There's parking everywhere. There's parking lots. I'll say that my own personal take is that I look at these parking lots and go, for places with runoff issues, we're just making the problem 10 times worse than it could be. And also think from the pedestrian point of view, parking lots are nightmares. Is there anything that can be done about sort of, and I know in Duluthians, when they walk more than half a block, they complain that there's not parking, but what can be done about this real surfeit of, all this good space being going to.
Listen, I love it. Push me on that. I would actually love if there was a concerted effort for us to push and look at parking with a totally different paradigm. A perfect example is if you do an aerial view of Canal Park, it is 100%. It isn't 100%. That's not accurate. It is so much surface parking. One of the things that helps solve that is building a parking ramp somewhere. So now you also have to consider there is a need for traffic to flow. There is a need for some parking. So then to also think about the cost of building a parking ramp, the aesthetic of building a parking ramp, the experience of building a parking ramp. The benefit of it may be that some of that surface area gets to be rebuilt. Pocket parks could be connectivity centers, could be, pedestrian corridors. It does come at a cost in the sense of we still have some mobility needs. Those won't go away. So I am here for that conversation. I love it. Whoever that is, if they want to, kind of organize and push and start getting people talking about it, remember that partly me and Jim's job is to have a sense of where the community's at, kind of have a general pulse of things. But when people make noise, it's actually really helpful. I don't take it personally. Jim doesn't take it personally. Our job is to be responsive to people. And it doesn't mean that you like me or don't like me. It doesn't mean that you like Jim or don't like Jim. It means you're passionate about your issue. And so it's actually really helpful when people coalesce that and they come at you. And I mean, coming at you sounds like aggressive language, but when you propose something, it gives me the ability to say, to again, use that layer of power and leadership and say, I am now starting to get concerned about this and I want our team to look at it. That's very different than me saying, yeah, I can look at it, or yeah, I've heard about that. So activate on that issue. I love it. I would love to talk more about that, especially as it relates to really important public spaces for us like Canal Park.
I get in trouble talking about parking. It's one of these things that I cannot stand parking lots, and I go too far on it, maybe politically. And so I'm eventually going to get in trouble because people, if you just ask them outright, they seem to want parking. I'm telling you, they don't actually want it. They just think they want it. And that's a dangerous thing for an elected leader to go say, like, no, you're just wrong. Your opinion's wrong. But the solution, like with anything, is to look at ways that if we're going to reduce surface parking lot surfaces, then we've got to replace it with something better. And so one, let's have honest conversations about how much parking we actually need, and then do better things with the spaces, because they really do interfere with development, both environmental resiliency, beautification of public spaces, and actual commercial development. If there's a parking lot there, a business isn't, by definition, and we almost always overbuild them. I mean, I'm going to try not say every parking lot fact I have, and I have far too many of them, but the two things I push for as strong as I can is, one, we always have to try and get rid of rules around parking. We in Superior repealed our parking minimums ordinance. It's been on the books for a long time. It made no sense at all. It required spaces for middle schoolers who don't drive at middle school. It was ridiculous. But and now when we do even private parking lot development, we try to incentivize green infrastructure. So if you're going to build it smaller, build it greener. It's better for your business. It's better for the surrounding community. But I agree with Emily. Folks should be loud about this stuff. We need to show folks that we can have a better community than that it can be more functional. I mean, the best cities in the world are not covered in parking lots. And so maybe, we need to get rid of some of that space and let it do something better for us.
Hey, I have just one quick final comment, if I could, on that topic. Jim, I love how passionate you are about this. It's awesome. And the only other person I know who might be equally passionate, maybe more so, is our CAO at the city of Duluth. Noah Shuckman has very strong feelings about this. And part of what we're trying to do now, and this would be interesting to talk to your group about, or hear from you about, is if we have to build a parking ramp in a short-term capacity, how is it being thought out and planned to be repurposed when we have more autonomous driving, when we have more ride share, when we have a stronger active transportation plan, so that we're no longer thinking about this parking ramp for the next 50 years. We're thinking about this parking ramp as a conduit to a business, a residential, setting in 12 years or something like that, that there is a way to think about that as a city, where this is where we're at right now. We want to drive movement forward out of kind of that entrapment of parking. But then how are we literally thinking, because parking spaces are also like 30 to 40 grand per space if you're building a parking ramp. So it's not like it's a cheap fix. So then what are you also doing to kind of advance future reuse of that structure as you're building it now?
Well, thank you both. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we keep going for another 3 or 4 hours. On behalf of Zeitgeist and Bus Bike Walk Week or Month, thank you very much. If you have a final word, love to hear it, but I know you probably have very busy schedules. Mayor Paine, anything more to say on parking lots?
Please say more.
I have a lot more to say on parking lots. Let's have another conversation about that. And if you can let me go absolutely crazy, it can be a lot of fun. Nope, I'm going to resist. My final words for the whole chat, I guess, is just, I think there are a lot of really great activists and advocates for active transportation, public transit. My challenge, I guess, for the summer, as we try to put the pandemic behind us, is try and use a different form of transportation. So if you primarily get around by bike or walking, try riding the bus a little bit more often. If you are not a common pedestrian, or even if you are, try to walk a little further and a little bit more often. Me personally, I don't ride a bike a lot. I'll try to get on the bike a little bit more. I think we all become better advocates when we experience the things that we're advocating for. And so, in other words, it's been a rough year. Let's just get outside.
I love
And
it.
Larson, any last words?
I will just say thank you for having us. I hope everyone's doing okay. It's been really a pleasure to hear some of your questions. I know that Jim probably shares my feeling, which is, you know, part of the fun of this job is listening to other people. And so please consider having us back for kind of a reversal, right? Where we get to hear from you. Your questions informed us a bit on what your values and priorities are. But, you know, for us to be able to listen to the experts in this room who are literally on the ground every day would be really, really useful. So I just want to confirm that your voice is really important. Jim and I have these two jobs, and we're two people of thousands and thousands of people in our communities. And so, you know, what you're doing, it's important. It really matters. When you build your base, you're helping to expand the base for everybody. So know that I think Jim and I, you know that our jobs are important, but we also know that your jobs are equally important and truly believe that. I think I guess I shouldn't always speak for Jim, but it feels like we are kindred in that commitment to public service as being a reflection of the public, and that your voice is really an important part of the work that gets done.
Thank you both very, very much. And thank you to Zeitgeist. So bye-bye.
Bye.